It is the Peer-to-Peer Policy Pod. I am Brian Morgenstern here with Sam Lyman, and I'm going to do something that up to this point I have never remembered to do, but I'll do it now. Hit that subscribe button, everybody, if you like hearing about business and Bitcoin and politics and public policy. Hit the subscribe button. Follow us on Twitter. I'm at MorgensternNJ. Sam Lyman 33 or at X. Sorry, I am behind the times. Well, welcome to the Peer-to-Peer Policy Pod. This week, it will be the first presidential debate of the 2024 cycle where Bitcoin may be a topic, and there are many other timely things to discuss. So, Sam, where should we get going today?
Yeah, let's talk about the intersection of, in my opinion, the two greatest memes in the world, Bitcoin and Donald Trump. So when we first started this podcast, Bitcoin had just blasted through all-time highs. We were resting comfortably above $70,000. Things looked great. Looked like it was all systems go to 100K. But since then, we've actually been ping-ponging back and forth in between the range from hell, between $60,000 and $70,000 for months at this time, right? And so people are speculating now, is there anything that can get us out of this range? One possibility might be Donald Trump, actually. So some analysts from Bernstein, if you wouldn't mind bringing up that article, Dylan, some analysts from Bernstein, which is a pretty well-known brokerage firm, they have speculated that crypto could actually be the beneficiary of the next Trump trade. So for those who don't know, in 2017, the Trump trade describes the huge soar or the huge takeoff in stocks and treasury yields that took place after Trump was inaugurated, with the speculation that he would make the economy great again. So now people are applying that same logic to the realm of crypto, thinking that crypto might benefit from Donald Trump winning election in November. So it could be, according to these analysts, that crypto or Bitcoin and other digital assets and Trump are now all tied together. But Brian, what do you make of this? Do you think that this new Trump trade could be a real thing? Is crypto's future tied directly to Donald Trump at this point?
It's possible. It is. Here's the frustrating part. It's going to be virtually impossible to actually tell the causal relationship, but we can make inferences. And one is that, favorable public policy in the US, not just on financial regulations, making it easier for consumers to hold Bitcoin and expanding the pie of potential customers. That, of course, could affect the price positively. Trump has taken a favorable position compared to Biden's, so it could have an impact on price. In the energy sector, Bitcoin miners obviously are highly dependent on cheap, abundant energy. And Trump has taken the position that the US has to be energy dominant. He wants to drill, baby, drill. He wants to build nuclear reactors. He wants to do everything to create as much energy as possible, in part to service the economy of the future with AI and other data centers that take a lot of energy. But Bitcoin miners would benefit from that, obviously, as well, and participate in that infrastructure build out because Bitcoin miners are flexible loads. So they can help finance build out of new energy and then turn off when the grid needs it. So they can be particularly integral in that build out. And Trump has talked about that. So there are public policies that Trump could usher in that could positively impact the price of Bitcoin. The reason why it's impossible to tell maybe the exact extent is that Bitcoin up till now still remains a bit of a risk asset. It's still sort of something that people hold as a small piece of their portfolio to get exposure to it. But when the market has gone down, so too Bitcoin has typically gone down a little bit. It's still been tracking the market slightly. So if the market in general goes up because Trump promises more favorable business policies, you might see Bitcoin go up, and it could be part of that wave. But those particular public policy positions, I think, would have some of that impact. It's just going to be hard to tell, exactly how much. Now, from a branding standpoint, there's nobody better at branding and increasing the value of a brand than Donald Trump, and he really has sort of wrapped his campaign. They've given a bear hug to Bitcoin because it's voters that are across the ideological spectrum, across party lines, across demographic lines, and he sees real pickup opportunities in swing states there. And so his embrace of Bitcoin has helped kind of mainstream it, and that could add brand value as well. So I guess my short answer is yes, I see the logic in this, that Bitcoin could get a Trump bump. It's the extent to which is his policies or his branding, or it's a general market optimism. It's hard to parse those factors. But I generally agree with the sentiment that, and we've said here, his policy prescriptions would be better for the Bitcoin ecosystem than Biden's, because Biden's basically been trying to put Bitcoin businesses under and just push them out of the U.S. So it's pretty stark contrast in terms of policy positions. So short answer is yes, but with some nuance in terms of which factors are contributing to that rise will be hard to tell.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think that crypto will benefit from this Trump trade, but I don't think it's exclusive to crypto. I think equities as well will benefit from the animal spirits that Trump activates. Those were very alive and well during his last administration. And on the campaign trail, he's talked a lot about just the amount of onerous regulations that have been imposed under President Biden. And he's intent on removing a lot of those regulations, which I think would free businesses from a lot of the constraints they've been under over the last 4 years and really give them an opportunity to innovate in a way that they haven't before. So it'll be really interesting to see how things play out just this week alone. You can see the markets have reactions in real time to events that take place on the campaign trail, even more so during election day. It might be interesting to see this week as well how markets react to the presidential debate that will take place this Thursday, which is actually the next topic of our discussion today, is the presidential debate. It's one of the earliest presidential debates we've ever had. It'll take place this Thursday, June 27th. We're going to have Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. Joe Biden has been locked down in Camp David almost the entire week doing debate prep. And I think a lot of people are going into this debate thinking that Donald Trump will wipe the floor with Joe Biden. But I'm a little more skeptical personally. I actually think Joe Biden will outperform expectations, especially because expectations are really low right now from the Biden camp. But it'll be really interesting to see how it all plays out. It'll be especially interesting to see whether or not Bitcoin comes up as a topic of debate. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think Bitcoin will be a prominent topic during this debate? And if so, how do you think Biden is going to handle that?
Well, I don't know if the moderators are going to ask a question on it or not, but I think it would be wise for President Trump to bring it up because it is a vulnerability for President Biden. His administration has been extremely hostile to the Bitcoin and crypto ecosystem. You've seen innovators, sort of self-proclaimed techno optimists, have been coming over to the Trump camp because they don't like the tax and regulatory agenda of the Biden administration. So you've seen it, this sort of set of issues be really kind of tide changing for a lot of soft Democrats and independents, and even maybe some kind of softer, more country club type Republicans, I guess, for lack of a better descriptor. They've kind of been driving, a little bit of a tide into the Trump camp. There was a big fundraising event in Silicon Valley with a lot of tech leaders who would have never previously come out for President Trump. There's, of course, we helped out with a Bitcoin mining event with President Trump, and have been, kind of helping facilitate conversations there to advance the policy discussion. So these are people who are not your typical base members of the MAGA coalition. These are new converts, people who Trump has really been welcoming into the fold, and presumably taking away from Joe Biden. So if he has an opportunity to bring up this point, that there are several million voters in swing states who are paying attention to the candidates' positions on Bitcoin and crypto and pro-innovation policies, this is a really important issue. And so President Trump may bring it up. I think it would be wise for him to do so. Think about past debates. Just put it in the context of past debates. if the candidates are targeting their messages at Michigan, for example, they're probably going to talk about making cars and union jobs. If they're targeting towards, other Rust Belt states, they're going to talk about bringing jobs back from overseas, repatriating wealth, to America. Some of these topics that you hear a lot about in presidential debates. Well, now Bitcoin and crypto and innovation more broadly is a big topic, and voters care about, particularly younger voters, people without strong party affiliations. This is a key voting block that's up for grabs. So whether or not there's a question, I think President Trump ought to raise it. We'll be paying attention. We'll be watching to see if it does come up. I hope it does. And this would be a historic milestone for Bitcoin and crypto, and to make an appearance in a presidential debate. That would be a huge deal, and just another data point on the road to kind of mainstreaming these ideas. So exciting stuff. Can't wait to watch.
Yeah, it's the Super Bowl for people who are into politics like us. So I'm looking forward to it as well. And I agree. I think Biden, if he wanted to take the opportunity, could really undo a lot of damage he's done in the last 3 years by being so hostile towards the Bitcoin and crypto community. Whether or not he takes that opportunity, I'm a little skeptical, but we'll see. And we'll see if Bitcoin even comes up as a topic of debate. But if it doesn't at this debate, I think it will at the debate in September, just because it's been such a hot issue on the campaign trail. So speaking of campaigns, as the campaign season heats up, so too are the Veep stakes, which is another way of saying the contest to see who will be Donald Trump's VP. So there are a lot of potential VPs out there. You've got Tim Scott from South Carolina. You've got Doug Burnham. You've got Nikki Haley, a lot of the usual suspects, right? And there's a lot of speculation right now as to who that VP pick will be. One person who knows actually is Donald Trump. Would you mind pulling up that Time Magazine article, Dylan? So Donald Trump actually announced yesterday that he has made his decision. The other person who doesn't know who the VP will be is Donald Trump's pick. He hasn't told that person yet. But there's a lot of speculation out there that Donald Trump might actually steal the show Thursday night by announcing his VP pick live on air. And he said that his VP will be in the audience, as will a number of other potential VP candidates. So it'll be really interesting to see how this all plays out. Brian, I know that you follow the Veep stakes pretty closely. Mm-hmm. At this point, who do you think it will be? And when do you think would be the ideal timing for this kind of announcement?
Great question. So I'll answer this, and then I want to go back 1 second to the debate. So if he announces his VP, I wonder if this is a tactic where if the moderators are misbehaving or President Biden shows up ready to play on game day, if then, grabbing the conversation like Trump is so good at, I wonder if that could be a tactic. Very clever and very apprentice-like to have the other potential candidates in the audience and to pick one of them. I mean, hilarious and so gripping and entertaining. I don't know is the short answer, but just looking into my crystal ball, it seems to me that a couple of the finalists are probably Senator J.D. Vance from Ohio and Governor Doug Burgum of North Dakota. And Burgum brings great experience in both the energy and tech sectors, which are two of the most important business areas in this election. He brings, management experience. He's an entrepreneur. He's low drama. In that kind of dynamic where, when Donald Trump is the nominee, you can't really have somebody in the VP spot who is going to be trying to outshine him in some way. That doesn't work. So Doug Burgum is a really good pick because he seems eminently competent and reasonable and just wants to serve kind of the greater cause, less egotistical than a lot of politicians. This is just my impression, my sentiment. So he could make a lot of sense. I think the other competing interest if you narrow the choices to Burgum and JD Vance, which again, I don't know if that's the case. I'm just trying to read some tea leaves. If JD Vance is the other, top finalist, he could be sort of a standard bearer for the populist agenda of, bringing jobs back to America, lower taxes and lower regulation, but really a focus on, America first in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy. And he's young. He's only 39 years old. So if he wants to be in politics for a long, long time, he certainly will be able to do that. And I know he has some very powerful friends in the Trump orbit. So I think those are kind of the two competing profiles that I see here coming down the stretch. Again, there could be a dark horse. There could be somebody that is outside that scope, but that's my guess at this point. Excuse me. It's a live show, everybody. Sometimes sneezes happen. I just going back to the debate and whether these issues are going to come up. If Joe Biden does address crypto and Bitcoin in any way, it's going to be super interesting to see, because his administration's policies have been very negative. So I'll be curious to see whether he doubles down and, with these sort of myths versus facts, saying, oh, it's only for criminals, or it's bad for the environment, or whatever these attacks have been against Bitcoin, whether he kind of doubles down on those attacks, or if he takes a more conciliatory tone and says, well, we want responsible innovation, or, some kind of astroturfed language to sort of gloss over his negative policies to date. On the VP debate, it's also a critical issue because, Burgum's an entrepreneur. He's an innovator. JD Vance, I believe, holds Bitcoin. He's one of, I think, 3 senators that are, vocally pro Bitcoin. Ted Cruz and Cynthia Lummis being other pro Bitcoin in the sense that like they themselves invest in it and they see the value in it. So it could be relevant to the VP choice as well. We'll see. What do you think? I don't know. Do you want to put on your look into your crystal ball?
Yeah.
See what you think.
In the early days, I thought that Tim Scott was the likely candidate. And that's because where the Republican Party was weakest in the midterms and in the 2020 election was with white suburban women. And just before Donald Trump became the nominee, Tim Scott became engaged to a white suburban woman. And I think it was true love, to be clear, but also an interesting optics in making a play for that particular demographic. I also think he brought a lot of sort of a different brand than Trump is usually associated with being very genteel, very willing to work across the aisle, and just an all-around friendly guy. So I thought potentially Trump might opt for Tim Scott to sort of balance out the ticket a little bit and to undercut any Democratic talking point that there wasn't enough so-called diversity on the Republican ticket. But since that time, I agree with you, Brian. I do think that Trump wants somebody who could easily be slotted in as president after he's done with his term in 2028. And Doug Burgum seems to fit that mold. As you said before, and as Trump himself has said, he's got the look. You want to pull up that
he's
tweet,
got
Dylan?
The look.
And when we say he's got the look, as you pointed out, Brian, I mean, he's the spitting image of George Washington.
Looks it is uncanny. He is Governor Burgum is like an AI generated image of if George Washington were president in 2024. And as Trump would say, this guy straight out of central casting. He really is. So, and optics matter. I don't believe that would be the reason for picking him, but I think it's an interesting data point for sure.
Agreed. Yeah, even the slicked back hair, it's uncanny. And I think the fact that Burgum has executive experience as governor goes a long way as well. I also think it's incredibly symbolic, as you mentioned, that Burgum is so pro innovation when it comes to energy and tech. I think this election will actually mark a sea change in American politics, where the Republican Party will be the party of tech and innovation. Historically, that's been more the Democratic Party. You've had liberal enclaves like San Francisco doing everything they can to get, Barack Obama or Joe Biden elected. But I think more and more, they're recognizing that the GOP, with its more libertarian bent, is more aligned with policies that help their businesses grow. So I think Doug Burgum would be a really interesting pick on that front. It would solidify this idea that the Republican Party is soon to be the party of tech and innovation. On the JD Vance front, I also think he's a really interesting choice. He wrote Hillbilly Elegy, which was a book that helped me understand our political landscape back in 2016. For those who don't know, Hillbilly Elegy is a memoir from JD Vance where he talks about his upbringing. He grew up in the manufacturing towns of Ohio that were just hollowed out by globalization and by the offshoring of American jobs. So he had a really rough upbringing, JD Vance. His mom really kind of fell into the opioid epidemic, and she had multiple marriages, and he really just came from a broken home. But it was his grandma who took him in and gave him that stability that he needed as a child. He didn't perform that well in high school, but then his grandma helped him turn things around. He joined the Marine Corps after high school. And in the Marine Corps is when he essentially learned how to be a man. He learned how to take responsibility for himself. And after the Marine Corps, where he served multiple tours overseas, he went on to Ohio State University. Oh, excuse me, the Ohio State University, where he got his undergraduate degree, and from there went to Yale Law School. And so he has this fascinating kind of rags to riches story. But what's so interesting about JD Vance is his ability to inhabit both worlds, the worlds of the working class and the worlds of the elite. And having spent a lot of time in elite America, I think he became pretty disillusioned with it. And he saw the hypocrisy that exists with our ruling class, where they run the government, academia, corporations, they run just about everything, but they don't seem to have much a sense of noblesse oblige. They don't seem to have much a sense of what the real needs and hopes and dreams are of working class America. And so I think JD Vance is a really interesting bridge between the elite and the working class, which I think is actually going to be the coalition that will fuel Donald Trump's drive to the Oval Office. So I agree with you. I think it's going to be Burgum or Vance. Tim Scott's my dark horse candidate, but we'll see. I don't think it's going to be Nikki Haley. I don't think the majority of Trump supporters would swallow that. And so it'll be really interesting to see how it all plays out. But then, of course, it could be any of these people. And then you have a lot of runners up who didn't become VP, but who could very well be members of his cabinet. So let's talk about that for a second, Brian. Of those who don't make the VP slot, who do you think would be good for cabinet positions in a Trump administration?
Oh, many. And I want to touch on the kind of coalition that you're describing. So right around the same time, or close in time to this sort of influential group of the techno optimists, the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the investors from Silicon Valley and elsewhere drifting towards Trump, you have these statistics being reported that Fortune 100 CEOs are not supporting Trump. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the legacy institutions that have been around a long time want to preserve the status quo. And the disruptors are seeing a little bit of themselves in Trump. At least that's my read on it. And I think you're right. That, Trump has been talking for 40 years about how China's eating our lunch, they're taking our jobs, et cetera. And people have felt that, obviously. I think that was a driving force to his sweep across the Rust Belt in 2016. I think you're seeing that potentially happen again in 2024, but with this added sort of boost from some innovators and entrepreneurs, disruptors. So I think the coalition is we're seeing a bit of a realignment across the country in really interesting ways, where it's not really Republican versus Democrat or liberal versus conservative at this point. It's sort of disruptors versus legacy, or the people, if you want to use populism, the people versus the system. And I think that's a lot of why people are drifting towards Bitcoin, because a lot of people are unbanked or underbanked. They're tired of their paycheck being hung up in a bank for 5 days before they can actually access it, or whatever it may be. We've seen a lot of political discrimination, people having accounts closed. We're seeing what's happening with the energy grid. We don't have enough power, and dispatchable power, and some of that is due to the growth of renewables and not as much growth amongst nuclear, natural gas, et cetera. And that affects, of course, jobs in the Midwest and the Rust Belt. It affects innovators in tech who want more energy for data centers, stuff like that. So these interesting, strange bedfellows, I think, are going to play a really integral role in this election. And it's just really interesting that at the same time that this weird coalition is forming, the legacy institutions are lining up behind the other side, behind Joe Biden and the Democrats. So really interesting dynamics here. So with that in mind, to address kind of the cabinet picks and stuff, one of the ones that comes to mind is Vivek Ramaswamy, entrepreneur, innovator, pro Bitcoin, wants to sort of take the, just because he's top of mind, Javier Milei's attitude in Argentina and just start slashing the government because we're spending too much. I'm not sure which agency he'd want to take over. He ran a healthcare company, so maybe HHS. He is big on, developing business in the US, so maybe commerce. I actually think with his attitude of cutting inefficiency out of the government, he'd be pretty ideally situated for the director of the Office of Management and Budget.
Yeah.
A lot of people, normies are not really familiar with this. It's an office within the White House, but it's a cabinet level position. The OMB director has tremendous amounts of authority over what new regulations can and can't go into effect. He has review authority over a lot of these things. He can stop things in their tracks. OMB, of course, administers, the president's budget. So he could have a really outsized role in terms of, cutting government inefficiency. I actually think that's kind of the ideal job for Vivek. Others, if Burgum is not the vice president, he'd be a pretty good energy secretary or interior secretary as a governor of, a rural state. We could see, Tim Scott could be, well, he's ranking member on Senate banking. So we could see him maybe as a financial regulator. He's been outspoken on so many issues. He was one of the great authors of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and Opportunity Zones. So we could see him in a role maybe administering some of those programs. I'm not really sure what agency he fits neatly into. So I do struggle to find which job would be perfect for him, but there may be one. Maybe commerce, maybe that's where he lands, or some other cabinet post, or position within the White House. I mean, he is great at outreach and bringing voters into the fold. We saw Congressman Cedric Richmond go into the Biden administration, the head of the Office of Public Liaison at the White House. It's an assistant to the president role. It's a very senior role. And your job is basically keep that coalition humming, go out, talk to people all around the country. I feel like that's maybe a little bit below his rank, but he'd be good at it. So a number of potential positions for him. Marco Rubio could find himself in the administration. I think his dream job is probably Secretary of State. He may have some competition for that role. I think extremely highly of Senator Bill Hagerty from Tennessee, and I think he'd make an excellent Treasury Secretary or Secretary of State or White House Chief of Staff. He could fit in a number of roles. If he doesn't go into the administration, I'd love to see him. And if the Republican Party ends up taking control of the Senate, he could be, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. That would be another potential role. Also a potential role for Tim Scott. He's already the ranking member. He could be the chairman of Senate Banking. Highly important position, extremely powerful. So that could be, he could stay in the Senate and be a chairman with a lot of authority. Some of the other candidates, I don't know, who else off the top of your head do you think should make it into the administration?
I think that's a pretty good rundown.
If there's an administration.
If there's an administration, no.
There's an eternity between now and election day. So it's fun to prognosticate, but who knows what's going to happen in the election.
Yeah, no, we can't get too bullish. But one thing that I've found very interesting in the discourse recently is that everyone's referring to Trump as the president. They're dropping the former. And I think a lot of people are just so optimistic about his prospects that we're already assuming as much. And I want to be careful because that's usually a top signal, right? You don't want to get too bullish. you don't want to count your chickens before they hatch. So, but I do think there's a really good chance that we do have a Trump administration. I'll be interested to see how Nikki Haley plays into all of this. I thought there was enough bad blood between them during the campaign that Trump would not want to associate with her anymore, but he himself has said that she'll have a role in his administration. So I'll be curious to see what that is. What you said that I agree with and really resonates with me is Vivek as the director of OMB. Like you said, it's an incredibly powerful position, and we could schedule F the heck out of the administrative state. And I think that would be an incredible benefit for the country just to get rid of a lot of the bureaucracy and the bloat that's out there in our government, which not only would help us reduce our expenses, but I think would ultimately make government more efficient over the long term. We have an interesting case study in Twitter. When Elon took over Twitter, a lot of people remember that he fired over half of the Twitter staff. And you had a lot of liberal prognosticators and a lot of establishment apparatchiks that were all saying that Twitter was going to shut down. It just wouldn't have enough people to run it anymore. But in fact, Twitter has been better than ever. It's gained more followers than it has in the years prior to Elon's takeover. And I mean, it's just doing incredibly well. So just apply that same logic to our federal government. We have a federal government that has not shrunk really, I don't think, any time in the last 100 years. And its budget keeps getting higher and higher. Its headcount keeps getting higher as well. And its efficiencies seem to only be getting worse. So I think that if you were to have a Vivek Ramaswamy in a prominent position in government who could really look at the way our government operates and see where we can make cuts, that could have a really good impact on the functioning of our government. So I'm optimistic.
Yeah. There are some other really great candidates out there who could serve in an administration, help kind of right the ship, make government more efficient, make it more focused on the American people. Recently heard a great talk by former director of national intelligence, John Ratcliffe. I hope he goes back into the government. He's a fantastic public servant. He's talked about kind of how the politicization, sorry, I struggle with that word, of intelligence agencies has really harmed our posture from a national security standpoint. Some of the things like the Defense Department and the intelligence community, the leadership has been focused on things like climate change and diversity and gender and all these things. These are agencies that are tasked with protecting our homeland and identifying and neutralizing threats. Like, that's their mission, and that's where they should be focused. So I think he'd be a fantastic one. Robert O'Brien, the former national security advisor, recently penned an op-ed about the contrast in foreign policy between these two candidates, where you had Trump starting no new wars, but eliminating Soleimani, eliminating al-Baghdadi, eliminating the caliphate, virtually bankrupting Iran, which sort of tilled the soil for the Abraham Accords and more normalized relations between Israel and Arab nations. So, O'Brien would be a great addition to the administration, maybe as a cabinet secretary, maybe state or DOD or something like that. Linda McMahon and Ray Washburn are both great business leaders who would be excellent secretaries of commerce, maybe. There's a really, really great bench. There's this, I think, misimpression out there that the good people won't want to go work for Trump because he's a bull in a china shop or whatever. I know a lot of great people who would go work in this administration who would serve very well and hopefully get us back on the right track. You mentioned Schedule F. That, for people who are not totally in this world, Schedule F was a proposed rule from the end of the first Trump administration where it would give the president the authority to fire bureaucrats who are of a senior enough level that they could, make or implement policy. I think I don't know if I agree with this characterization. It's sort of been labeled the Fauci rule. Like, how do you end up with all these middle managers who have just languished there for 40 years, even though they're not good at their job? We need the authority to fire them. I think it's a pretty good policy proposal. Honestly, I think we need to go farther just because of how badly the federal budget is right, is performing right now. We've talked about this on this podcast. Debt, servicing the debt, national defense, Medicare, Social Security, just those programs cost more than the tax revenue we are collecting. So if we only had those and nothing else, we would still be running deficits. So you want to know why we have out of control inflation? That's it. So we need radical change at the federal level in terms of getting our budget under control. Schedule F would be a great tool. It's not nearly enough, in my opinion. So we need some really innovative, strong leaders to come into the government, no matter who's in charge. So I'm optimistic, cautiously, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to see how it all plays out. And you mentioned, Brian, just now that there's a lot of people who would be willing and capable of working in a Trump administration, even more so, arguably, than there were in 2016, because I think this is in keeping with what we've called the vibe shift. So what is the vibe shift? If I were to explain it in just a few words, I would say that the vibe shift is the swing of the cultural pendulum back to the tried and true and away from the radical leftist policies that defined the 2010s. It's this idea that advertisers used to parrot woke talking points whenever they had the chance, and now they're doing everything they can to run away from those same talking points. It's the manifestation of cringe that we see when people espouse the policies and ideas of the 2010s, again, those woke ideas. A lot of businesses are running away from those things. And it's also this phenomenon that we're seeing right now that it's actually cool and acceptable to love America again. Hating your country is not a cool thing, and it's not sustainable. And so this is what I describe as the vibe shift. And as part of the vibe shift, you're seeing a lot of billionaires, a lot of business leaders, a lot of people in the elite milieu, for example, starting to break towards Donald Trump, which we didn't see as much of that in 2016. You had a few anomalies like Peter Thiel and others, but they were definitely exceptions to the rule. But there's some big changes afoot right now. We saw two signs of what I'm discussing here just last week when Cathie Wood, who's the head of ARK Invest, very prominent investor, well-known name on Wall Street, and Chamath from All In, both of them came out and formally announced their support for Donald Trump. In addition to that, Donald Trump appeared on the All In podcast, which is arguably the most influential tech podcast in the country. And it's a really fascinating dynamic between the four hosts of the All In podcast. I would say two historically are more liberal, two are more conservative. And over time, though, you've seen David Sachs, who's the most prominent conservative on the podcast, red pill his co-host. And you saw that this last week when the All In pod hosted Donald Trump himself. And at the very end, they asked Jason Calacanis, who is the quintessential liberal on the podcast, what did you think? And Jason Calacanis couldn't deny that he was impressed, that he was maybe even a little bit swayed by Donald Trump's pitch on that podcast. So this is fascinating because going back to our discussion earlier, that coalition between the working class and a certain subsection of the elite, I think is what will be the coalition that will fuel Trump's presidency, that will drive him into the Oval Office. I think it's a vibe shift that's very real and it's taking place, which raises an interesting question. And I'm curious your thoughts on this, Brian. Is it acceptable in polite society to be publicly pro-Trump now?
It's a lot more acceptable than it used to be. TDS is still very real. There are people out there who still are convinced that Donald Trump is the worst thing in the world. Hard to move somebody off such a deeply held conviction. But I'll quibble a little bit with your characterization of the All In hosts. Politics. Sachs, I think, is unabashedly conservative with a populist bent. Chamath is a lifelong Democrat, but who is curious and persuadable and seems to be he's rethought the Trump presidency. He said this on the podcast. He said that he had kind of bought into the media narratives and now he's rethought it. I think his eyes were opened when they discussed foreign policy with Jared Kushner, who was masterful, in my opinion, in the administration. J-Cal is, I think, quintessential Democrat. I think Friedberg is centrist. I mean, his main issue is the budget and debt and deficit and inflation. And I think he views that, not through a partisan lens, but through math So, but all that said, it's definitely becoming more acceptable. I mean, Bill Ackman, another very impressive billionaire investor, seems to be drifting towards Trump in part because of the anti-Semitism we're seeing in universities, the feckless response from the Biden administration with regard to violence in the Middle East, and how that region has just kind of collapsed under his leadership because he allowed Iran to sell more oil and make more money, and he decreased sanctions. That has led to very predictable more violence. He restored funding to the UN, human rights group that basically has been funding Hamas. So there's some of these issues that kind of cut across partisan boundaries, and you're seeing, I think, a lot of very influential people kind of kick the rust off and say, all right, we need a new approach, and maybe Trump was right about a lot of things. You cited that interview by Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, who went on CNBC and said maybe Trump was right about China, maybe he was right about the border, maybe he was right about tax policy. That's a pretty soft position coming from Jamie Dimon, who I also believe is sort of a lifelong, pro-business Democrat, but seems to be kind of drifting. Who knows where he'll land, but that's a long way of saying in 2016, nobody believed Trump would become president. Nobody thought he would get elected. And so nobody wanted to go out on a limb and say, I'm for Trump, because they figured, well, he's going to lose anyway, and then I'm just going to be associated with the losing team. And nobody wants to be associated with the losing team. Now, people saw him win once, and they see what I've described again before as kind of the ripples or the snowball building as it rolls down the hill. It all started with the botched Afghanistan withdrawal, the tragic Afghanistan withdrawal, which has continued to people seeing the tragedy on the border. It's continued to people seeing Russia invade Ukraine, people seeing Hamas's atrocities against Israel, runaway inflation that makes people feel financially insecure. All these things are rolling down the hill and becoming a bigger and bigger snowball. And you combine that with the fact that Trump won against all expectations and governed quite well. I think you see a lot of people opening their eyes. We've seen a lot of media bias exposed. We've seen a lot of, obviously, the policies I've just described. I just think this is a cocktail that has created an environment where it's a lot more acceptable today than it was 8 years ago to support Trump. So I'm glad to see business leaders kind of take the gloves off and say wokeism is bad, DEI is bad, weak foreign policy is bad, inflation is bad. Stating things that are common sense, but they might not have had the nerve to do that in the past. It takes one leader at a time to stand up and say it out loud, and it's resonating. I think that's a very positive development. We can't have a functioning democracy or representative republic without the truth. So I think the truth is winning a little bit, and in this environment, I think that's leading to what you described, a vibe shift, which I think Donald Trump is at this moment the beneficiary of. Again, the election is forever away, but this is a moment right now that it feels different. Feels
very different. And if there's any lesson that we can take away from this, it's that courage is contagious. All it takes is one or two people in the elite class standing up for a lot of their friends to do the same. And I think you also touched on something interesting earlier in the episode, Brian, which is what I like to describe as kind of a cold civil war going on amongst the elites right now, where you have the disruptors, people in Silicon Valley, those who started their own companies, and the defenders of the status quo. Another way of framing that might be the founders versus the CEOs, those who built their companies from the ground up versus those who inherited a CEO position and might be excellent managers, but don't have the same skin in the game as those whose business is their baby. And I think in the former category, a lot of those people are the ones who are coming out in support of Donald Trump. The establishment be damned, right? Because they recognize that this guy is a disruptor. He's someone who's not satisfied with the status quo, and he's someone who will take away regulations that are hamstringing our businesses and hampering innovation. And so it will be really fascinating to see who else comes out over the next few months in support of Trump. I do think that it might be a trickle that will develop into a waterfall, because I do think he's going to win this November. But again, like you said, it's pretty far away still. We got several months to go. So it'll be fascinating to see how it all plays out.
Yeah, for sure. Well, as we said, it's the disruptors versus the legacies. It's the people versus the system. You got the Rust Belt and Silicon Valley locking arms for the first time in our lifetime. So really, really interesting dynamics with founders and union workers sort of versus Fortune 100 CEOs on the other side. Really, I mean, I didn't really see things going this way, but here we are. And I think it's really exciting to watch. Realignments every so often are healthy for the country. So excited to see the next few months.
Yeah, let's close today with our grab bag section. Speaking of disruptors,
Yeah,
I know you're a big fan of Milei down in Argentina. So what do you have for our grab bag today, Brian?
yeah. So our libertarian punk rocker style president in Argentina. I think the number one issue, if you ask the American people today, my guess is that inflation is probably top of mind because it affects their pocketbooks the most. It's certainly top of my mind. I mean, I've seen extreme inflation over the last few years. One estimate was the dollar's lost 25% of its value just since 2020. It seems pretty accurate to me. Larry Summers did some analysis, former Treasury Secretary for President Obama, did some analysis. I think he was looking at it in the 18 to 20% range as well. And that's because the federal government currently doesn't measure inflation very well. They've taken really core elements out of it, like mortgage rates. I believe fuel costs are in there. Some things that have really risen quite a bit. So when you factor in the stuff that people have to buy every day, inflation is really pronounced and it is weighing on people's minds. Well, how do you stem inflation? One of the key ways that I think virtually every economist would agree is if you cut government spending, if you stop printing so much money, if you make dollars more scarce, then the value of those dollars is likely to go up, versus which increases, your purchasing power. And so we have an experiment going on in real time in Argentina, where President Milei was elected on a promise of slashing government, and he has done that. So, Dylan, why don't we pull up the graphic there? I love the picture. President Milei holding up a chainsaw. He has famously said he's just going to go in there and chop, chop, chop. He eliminated like half of the agencies out of his federal government. That included a department that was charged with administering DEI programs and other things of that nature. And Argentina's seen for the first time in decades, inflation has sort of stalled out. The cost of food has leveled out. His country's currency is stabilizing. He's also very pro Bitcoin. Has talked about it as returning, money to where it originated, which is the private sector. So he's trying out some of the stuff that you and I talk about, and that a lot of our colleagues in the industry talk about, and it seems to be working quite well. He is very popular. He has one of the highest approval ratings of any world leader. And he has gained that by just cutting the heck out of government spending. And he's reduced inflation dramatically. And his country is getting stronger relative to its neighbors who have more left, socialist governments with higher spending. So he is, I think, sort of proof in the pudding here that what America needs to do next is to cut the government, to get inflation under control and make people more financially secure. Stop taking money out of the economy and feeding the bureaucratic beast with it, but rather have more money in the private sector so that we can create new value and increase purchasing power for Americans. So wanted to give a shout out to Javier Milei, who seems to be doing a great job down in Argentina. And we should take notice here in the US.
Agreed. It's pretty incredible to have an Austrian economist as a head of state, maybe a harbinger of things to come. So will be really interesting to see how this all plays out, and we'll be with you every step of the way. One more reminder to like and subscribe if you like what you've heard here today. And I think that about closes things up for today.
Yeah, like and subscribe. Follow us on X at MorganSternNJ, at Sam Lyman33, and a very happy anniversary to my wife, Teresa. I will see you home tonight. We'll have a great dinner and celebrate. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time.